Good morning. Thank you for the invitation and putting together such extraordinary conference with wonderful speaker. Our session will discuss one of, I think, most complicated topics on global migration, and this is the connection between global migration and cultural identity. And immigration policy is really a fascinating field to explore national identity, and this is because the substance of the requirements we demand them to accept, to adapt in order to join us, that reflects not only who we are, or in many cases think we are, and what kind of nation we want to be, but also it mirrors what we want other people to think we are. So in a way, immigration, more than any other field, has encouraged nation-states to define themselves. If you want, drafting immigration policy, in a sense, it's like it's a form of nation building. And there are many questions that come to the fore when we talk about global migration and cultural identity. I would like to use 3 or 4 minutes to map 5 core issues that we will discuss today in different versions. So the first issue is the conceptual challenge, or the conceptual issue. We really must go back to the core, to the most fundamental concept that we discussed. Of course, the banality is what is culture, what is identity, what is cultural identity, what does it even means to have a cultural identity. But I think we also might, and sometimes should, reflect on the very concept of migration. We take it for granted that we talk about migrants, and the challenge or the opportunity comes from immigration. But even the concept of migrants is, we follow a very controversial UN definition of who is a migrant. Do you know who is a migrant according to the UN? So the definition, and I quote, is any person who lives outside the country of origin, regardless of irrespective of the reason, for more than 1 year. And of course, when we say that we have 260 million migrants, we mean that we have migrants strictly defined by the UN. When we add to it irregular migrants, asylum seekers, displaced people, and internal migrants, we have 740 million internal migrants. I wonder whether we should still talk about migration and not human mobility. We have more than 1 billion people on the move. So the first thing is really to talk about the concept. What are the concepts we are talking about, their essence and the meaning? The second issue is empirical. How does immigration, whatever it means, affect cultural identity? Again, whatever it means. Globally, regionally, nationally, but also on the municipal level, locally. How should we measure successful integration into the cultural identity? How effective are citizenship tests, language requirement, loyalty oath, integration contracts in promoting social cohesion and integration? And what do we really know about the second and even the third generation immigration when it comes to integration? And how do we do a successful cross-country immigration comparison? So we have conceptual challenge, we have empirical challenge. The third challenge is the one that Professor Halbertal posed yesterday, and this is the normative, the legal question. How legitimate is it for a political community to restrict immigration in general, or in certain immigrants in particular, in order to protect, to preserve the so-called cultural identity, or some version of cultural identity? What requirements are justified in imposing on newcomers, when and how? That's kind of the biggest question, the normative question that was discussed yesterday. The first issue, fourth issue is the theoretical one. So we have the conceptual, empirical, legal, and then the theoretical. The answer to each of the normative questions that we can discuss varies according to different theoretical perception on citizenship. So obviously, liberals, Republicans, communitarians, and cosmopolitans might have a different answer to this question. But I think it's also would not be correct to ignore the reality outside that certain states have different conception of peoplehood. The ethnic religious version of peoplehood, like Israel or Japan, the civic political version, and in between the cultural version. And judging one conception of peoplehood by the standard of another conception of peoplehood is sometimes theoretically wrong. I always tell my colleagues from France and America that they are lucky because their particular has become universal, but it's not always the case like that. And the last big question or challenge issue to address is the ethical one. And this is the question raised yesterday by Professor Waldron. What is the right thing to do according to our morality principle, in particular principle of justice? And what does the principle of justice entail when it comes to global migration? How many? And mainly according to which conditions? And you ended up, Professor Waldron, yesterday with a thought experiment. Let me build on that and add my own thought experiments. So the year is 2020, next year. Let's imagine that President Trump is re-elected. And let's further imagine, that 20 million, 25 million Americans who are disappointed of the new reality, not the new, the continuous reality in the United States, they decide to migrate and they move to Canada. Now, if you take, or they want to move to Canada, if you take the traditional grounds for exclusion, they would not be so, they wouldn't apply to their case. Nobody would seriously claim that there is a security risk, or there is a welfare burden, or there is a threat to liberal values and institutions. Certainly culture wouldn't be, at least language, because they speak English, so this would not be a big issue. And we can't claim that there is a main central issue of public health or public order. My question, and I leave it open, even though I have my own answer to this question, but the question would be, what can, if at all, be the ground for exclusion when Canada, a country of, I think, 38 million, would say there is a number in which, even though all those traditional grounds do not apply, we don't accept more Americans to our territory. And we can do the same thought experiments with Germans who want to move to Austria or to the German-speaking canton in Switzerland, and you name the other example that we can bring in. So those type of questions are really at the core of our debate on our session on global migration and national cultural identity. And I would like to present the speakers. I will do it not in a row, but one speaker at a time. Our first speaker is Professor Majid Al-Haj. He is the head of the Center for Multiculturalism at Haifa University. His field of expertise include Israel studies, political sociology, immigration, and comparative ethics relations. His recent book, which you have here, just published 2 weeks ago, is called The Russians in Israel, a New Ethnic Group in Tribal Society, and this will be the focus of his talk. So, please.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to have been invited to speak to this distinguished forum. I don't intend to give a lecture, but rather to share with you some of my thoughts on the issues of immigration, assimilation, and multiculturalism. My presentation will focus on ethnic formation and identity among Russian immigrants in Israel, or the 1990s immigrants from the former Soviet Union in Israel. It is based on, as Liav said, on my book, which just came out. I received one copy last week. It's called The Russians in Israel, a New Ethnic Group in a Tribal Society. It was published by Routledge, London. This study is one of the most detailed studies on Russian immigration in Israel. It covers 30 years of research since the first wave of these immigrants in 1989. It is based on quantitative and qualitative methods, focus groups, national surveys, document analysis, and other methods. Now, this study is done from a global perspective, because I have to indicate from the very beginning what Yehudit Shuval just mentioned in one of her articles, that the sociology of immigration in Israel is different probably than any other perspective of sociology, because it remained relatively conservative, since it is based not on a global perspective, but on local Zionist paradigm, which perceives immigration not as a demographic process, but as a value process. That is, in everywhere in the world, immigrants move from one home to find another home. According to the Zionist perspective, Jews everywhere are in the diaspora, are strangers until they come to their natural home, which is Israel. This is why also the notions that are used usually are not regular demographic notions. I'm going to use demographic notions and also to challenge the existing perspectives on this issue of immigration. Now, I want to start with a brief theoretical considerations regarding the issue of the options that are offered to immigrants elsewhere. One of the widely cited models is the model of John Berry on acculturation. It has two main facets. One facet has to do with the attitudes of immigrants, and the second has to do with the attitudes of the receiving society. From the perspective of immigrants, there are four options. I won't go ahead and mention them because it would take time, but I will concentrate in two issues. One of them is assimilation, when immigrants choose to assimilate within the existing or the receiving society. And the second, integration, when they want to maintain their culture, but at the same time also to take from the receiving culture. From the perspective of the receiving society, there are also four perspectives, but I think that two are central, which is assimilation, when the melting pot strategy is applied, and the second is multiculturalism, when the uniqueness of the immigrants are admitted, and then the immigrants also contribute to the society and take from the culture of the society. Now, the former policy of Israel has been based mainly on the issue of melting pot. Because of the Zionist perspective that sees kibbutz galuyot as the main aim, that aims to create one nation, it should be followed by mizug galuyot. Mizug galuyot, which is a fusion of exiles. This is why that kor ha'hituch has been the main policy. But kor ha'hituch doesn't mean actually the creation of a new culture. It means the melting of the Mizrahi groups within the existing Ashkenazi elite. Within the existing Ashkenazi culture. Now, kor ha'hituch actually has become kor hituch. I mean the cutting pot and not melting pot. In any event, actually, there have been many changes over time, and the Israeli society have become more open and more pluralistic over time, mainly regarding Russian immigrants in Israel. Also, the Russian culture is not perceived as a threatening culture or is not perceived as a hostile culture. It's perceived as a friendly culture and legitimate culture. But the Israeli society also has been affected by global changes and has been changed over time. But despite of this issue, the main core is still the melting pot. Now, regarding the Russian immigrants in Israel, this is one of the most important immigrant waves since the establishment of Israel. And just to tell you some numbers, between 1989 and 2016, about 1 million immigrants came to Israel. If you add them to the 1970s immigrants, we have 1 1.5 million Russian immigrants who form the largest community according to a country of origin. As a matter of fact, since the establishment of Israel, 3.2 million came to Israel. Among them, 39% came from the former Soviet Union. And this is actually a mass immigration that has affected Israeli society in every measure. The question is whether these immigrants form a new ethnic group or have they assimilated within the existing Mizrahi-Ashkenazi division. There are many perspectives. One of them, the assimilation perspective. Sami Smucha is here. Sami believes that the Russian immigrants in Israel will eventually be assimilated within the middle class of the Ashkenazi group. And Kimmerling also believes, the late Kimmerling believes that they will assimilate within the Ashkenazi group. Now, the group of the sociologists coming from Russian immigrants themselves think otherwise. They think that they are a transnational community, that they have a dual homeness and dual identity. But even though among them, like Larissa Remnick, Sabina Lisitsa, and Julia Lerner, none of them suggested that these immigrants form a new ethnic group in Israel. Sami Smucha suggested that they are subculture. Kimmerling suggested that they are bubble. And the third group suggested that they are a transnational community, but none of the sociologists actually indicated that they are a new ethnic group. Now, when I came to deal with these issues, I applied all theories of ethnicity since Weber until today, in order to say what are the criteria that actually define an ethnic group. And to make a long story short, there are 5 criteria. One of them, the objective elements that are connected with the country of origin. The second, the subjective elements that are connected with the ethnic consciousness and ethnic pride. Behavioral elements, if immigrants behave ethnically in the new society. Self-definition, how they define themselves. And other definition, how they are defined or perceived by the receiving society. Based on all the statistics and the analysis, I can argue that these immigrants form a new ethnic group according to every criteria. First of all, according to the objective elements, they have common homeland, the former Soviet Union, common language, and culture. Secondly, according to the behavioral elements, they continue to behave and to maintain their culture and language after coming to Israel. And in many places, they have established even Little Russia, like in Haifa, in Carmel, in Ashdod, and in many cities. Over 70% of them speak just Russian, even if they know Hebrew, speak just Russian if they meet another Russian immigrant. The main culture has remained Russian. The ethnic pride that they have in this culture is something which is common to all immigrants. It's not only ethnic pride. As a matter of fact, they have a sense of superiority over the Israeli society that is perceived from their perspective as an Oriental society. Also, according to the self-definition, 30 years after the arrival of this group, it's true that there has been a dynamic in terms of the elements of their identity. The Israeli element has become the strongest. Second, the ethnic element, and then other elements. But the Israeli element goes hand in hand with the ethnic element. And most immigrants would identify by such a combination of the citizenship element and the ethnic element all together at the same time. And the other things regarding their characteristics, that these immigrants have chosen cultural dialogue with the Israeli society. They have chosen to be cultural producers, not only cultural consumers. They don't want only to take from the existing culture, but they have to contribute to this culture and to take from that culture. Also, they have multiple identity. That is, Russians in Israel, Russian Israelis, you know, many of the scholars call them Russian Israelis or Israeli Russians or Russian-speaking Israelis. This combination exists and reflects the main identity that they have developed over time. Also, the existence of many of the cultural and ethnic institutes in Israel, like ethnic media and also the media from the former Soviet Union. All these just reinforce their ethnic orientation. To add to this, that they have chosen the ethnic identity not out of alienation. They are not alienated from the Israeli society. As a matter of fact, all studies, including those of Lisak and Leshem and others and my study, indicate that over time, larger and larger proportion of these immigrants think that they feel at home in Israel and that their integration in Israel has been a success story. So the identity that they have developed, it's not out of alienation. It's what I call instrumentalized identity. That is, it has the component of pride, but at the same time, it has also the component of pragmatism that is used in order to promote their status within the Israeli society as a group. They have chosen to integrate in the Israeli society from a point of strength rather than to assimilate from a point of weakness. I think that they have chosen a path which is different than the path of Edot HaMizrach or Mizrahiyim. Now, to conclude, according to every measure, and I know that I'm going to say probably some provocative conclusions, but according to every measure, this group forms a new ethnic group in Israeli society. Compared with other recognized ethnic groups in Israel, Ashkenazim and Mizrahiyim, these immigrants are the most salient ethnic group in Israel, much more than the Ashkenazi and much more than the Mizrahi altogether. It would be even fair to say that they are the only group entitled to be recognized as a full-fledged ethnic group according to every theoretical measure. Because many have said, including Goldberg and Eliezer ben Raphael and Arnold Lewis, that the ethnicity, the division between Ashkenazim and Mizrahiyim is based mainly on the otherness. That is what each group is not, and not what each group is. That is, many of those included in the Mizrahi groups are mainly non-Ashkenazi. Because if you take Moroccans, and if you take those came from Turkey, what are the common elements? According to all the criteria that I have counted, except for the other definition, that they have been perceived by the Ashkenazi groups as different culturally. And what is the common elements between those who came from Romania and those who came from United States? Except for the very fact that both of them are non-Mizrahi. This is why many sociologists call this ethnicity a phantom ethnicity or imagined ethnicity. The ethnicity among Russian immigrants is a real ethnicity based on every measure that applies to what is an ethnic group. This is why I think that these facts should be recognized among sociologists and also among officials, including official statistics in Israel, including the Central Bureau of Statistics, that has decided that they belong to two groups. Those who came from Asia are included within the Sephardic, and those who came from Europe are included within the Ashkenazi, but they are Russians. And a final fact, about 500,000, I would say 420,000 are considered as others because they are non-Jewish, according to the halakha. And the percentage of this group is increasing all the time. Because in recent years, over 60% of those who came from Ukraine and Russia are non-Jews, according to the halakha. This group perceives its ethnicity as a basic element that connects all of them together and not any other element. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Al-Haj, for the thought-provoking discussion. I'm sure we'll get back to it in the Q&A. Our second speaker, Mark Lilla, is a professor of humanities at Columbia University. He specializes in intellectual history with a particular focus on Western political and religious thought. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. And his recent book from 2017 is titled The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. Please.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. Elite discussions of immigration and multiculturalism have a rather conventional arc. And I would like to break that arc a little bit today and to take a second look at these questions from the perspective of what I think is also on everyone's mind, which is resistance to immigration and resistance to multiculturalism. For my sins, I spent a lot of time reading right-wing literature and trying to understand people who write these things and are moved by these things from within. And the more time I spend with that literature, the more I come to see how much of a disconnect there is between two perspectives on these questions. It's not just that they disagree over policies, but have different views about actually what is going on. The conventional view goes something like this. We're experiencing globalization that's bringing different populations together. When those populations come together, there's a sentiment of difference. A sentiment of difference can lead to a kind of identity crisis on both sides. There are reactions to those things. Conflict can happen, and in particular, immigrant groups can be scapegoats for other sorts of social problems. And so when it comes to coping with resistance to immigration and to multiculturalism, the response is generally that, well, we have to learn how to teach toleration to our children. We need to emphasize human rights, universal values, and also in some way we need to weaken the attachment of peoples, certainly in the dominant culture, to their own culture, so that the connections, it's fine if there are different ethnic groups and they all cook curry in a different way, but as soon as the differences among them become serious and, so to speak, existential, it makes us nervous when they pose actually different ways of life. Now, this is a large part of the story. Toleration's a good thing, but I think that the assumptions of this approach are thin, in the sense that it misses important developments that are going on. One of them is what I want to call monoculturalism, because there have been two different consequences of globalization, cultural ones. On the one hand, Cultures now come more into contact because of immigration, because of people moving to urban centers, because of telecommunications and the rest. On the other hand, globalization is also effacing differences among cultures. There is less cultural variety in the world today than when I and when most of you were young. And young people today, no matter where they come from, resemble each other much more than we did when we were their age. They look at the same media, they speak the same way. Their vocabulary consists of 3 or 4 words. They're much more comfortable with each other than adults or their parents might be with each other. There's been a flattening of the cultural landscape. I'll give you a very quick example would just be cuisine. The great fear with globalization was that we'd be all eating McDonald's. Instead, what's happened is we all have a set palette of ethnic restaurants that appear in every major center. That has become our elite McDonald's. But having all those restaurants does not mean you have children who are being brought up in cuisines that they will then pass on to their children and grandchildren. Rather, eventually, everyone's going to be learning cooking from cookbooks, and no one's going to be learning anything from their grandmothers. It's a small example, but it shows just how much flattening has taken place. But this flattening has taken place especially at the level of elites, and that means people like us. Elites who are Anglophone, who are generally liberal and cosmopolitan, have enlightened to our light's views on sex and abortion and divorce, are skeptical of dogmatic religion, and also of natural attachment. A lot of catchphrases are circulating about this difference. People from nowhere, people from somewhere, court and country. But if we look at immigration and multiculturalism from the point of view of people who are not part of our elite, it looks very different. It has a double quality. On the one hand, it means that people who do not share the vestiges of the particular culture you still have entered, and so there's a difference there. But immigration can also feel like an imposition of an elite monoculture that is transnational, that shares the same values, that is comfortable traveling, comfortable with languages. And so, paradoxically, multiculturalism as a value is part of an elite monoculture that is being imposed. This is how it may look from below if you read anti-immigrant and anti-multicultural literature. So that strangely, immigrants are not just seen as poor immigrants like ourselves or people struggling within a country, but rather are seen as avatars for an elite class that does not understand people from traditional populations who are not privileged in the society. Now, one day someone's going to write an interesting book on the taste for multiculturalism among cultural elites in the 20th and 21st century. We love it. People in more popular classes generally do not, or often do not. So what's that about? What is our psychology about? Well, you may know that during the reign of Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette had built for herself in the back of Versailles a place where she could have a little farm. It was called Le Hameau de la Reine, where when she felt like putting on country clothing and churning butter, she could go spend the afternoon and do that and still be back at the palace in time for whatever the dinner would be. Well, there's something of that quality to our major cities today. elites like ourselves are able to experience the richness and diversity of cultures without having to commit to any of them ourselves. That's what distinguishes us, not only from the immigrant populations, but also from the popular classes within our countries. Multiculturalism provides a safe kind of communal nostalgia for cosmopolitan classes like ourselves who do not want to be constrained by any particular tradition, any particular religion, or any particular culture. How does this look from below? Well, my sense is that non-elite historic populations feel a double imposition. The imposition of an alien population that will compete for jobs and so on, but also an imposition from an upper class that has different values from themselves that include not only multiculturalism, but views about sexuality and views about immigration. And much of the reaction we see to immigration today is a rejection or a rebellion against a perceived class that is imposing all of these things. It's not just about immigration, nor can it be reduced to economics, as some people wish to do. Oh, it's because people are have fewer opportunities economically that they turn on immigrants. That's not how people who are part of that world and write about that world see things. They see an overclass that is imposing something on them. And so that trains them to look at immigrants in a certain way as a representative of this larger class. Now, the problem of feeling an imposition is part of a larger phenomenon, which is the loss of political agency generally in the face of globalization. Take Europe as an example. Not only are European nations facing a challenge of immigration they cannot control, but they all are simultaneously trying to create a transnational state or quasi-state in the European Union. So there's not a strong sense in Europe of where you go to make your voice heard on some of these questions, particularly on immigration. It's being handled above your head, and it's being handled below your head. But it's not being handled by, or the perception can be, by political parties offering different views on this and then able to deliver. So my sense is that we're not going to see much change in views towards multiculturalism and immigration unless or until there's a greater sense of control and sense of democratic agency within our countries. That's why, unlike some people, and this came up last night in the discussion, I do think that now is the time to devolve powers more to the nation state, not less. Because that is a place where you can have a voice, where parties can have a voice. It's interesting that when people talk about immigration, as they did last night, they tend to use the words society or state. One society comes into contact with another society. Or there's a state that's up here, and there are different kinds of groups down here for which they are responsible. The word polity never gets used. But what we are talking about with immigration is whether people will join a polity, whether the polity is asked, whether they want to invite people, whether they're capable of assimilating at the political level, I'm not talking about the cultural level, and whether we want to give new people voice in this collective decision making. Well, there's a weak sense of civic identity right now and of democratic agency that is underneath many of the reactions to multiculturalism and immigration today. Now, of course, I'm not saying that intolerance is not a problem. Though it's interesting that in many states, certainly in the United States, that the less contact people actually have with immigrants, the more anti-immigrant they are. And that should tell you something, which is that it's not about immigration for a lot of these people. It's about this picture of the world that they have developed and that bears some relation to their reality. And so what we need to be thinking about is how to make our democracies more responsive, more open, and increase a sense of civic identity and civic solidarity so that we make it easier rather than harder for people to be generous. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Lilla for a presentation that shows the complexity of the topic, but also the different paradoxes involved. My sense is that this sense of lose of control is related more to mobility than migration, but we can perhaps discuss it later. The last year or two trend in Europe is, especially in small cities, is related to mobility, those anti-tourist laws. I'll give you an example. Where I come from now, just last week, Florence, the cultural identity of a small city like Florence is affected more by Airbnb. 32% of the apartments in the city center are rented by Airbnb than global migration. Our third speaker is Professor Esra Ozyurek. She is a professor and the chair of contemporary Turkish studies at the London School of Economics, LSE. As a political anthropologist, she seeks to understand how Islam, Christianity, secularism, and nationalism, how they are placed with one another in Turkey, but also in Europe. And she is also the recipient of the Barkan Prize for the best article in Turkish studies. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation and coming here to listen to me in this beautiful weather. So I am interested in how ideas, ideologies, beliefs, religions move across real or imaginary boundaries and what kinds of new lives they gain in their new contexts. I recently published a book about Germans who convert to Islam, and while doing that research, I became very curious about how do Muslim background Turks and Arabs in Germany can be converted to Germanness. You know, obviously analogy is not perfect, but that was the idea behind my new research, where I studied how do Turkish and Arab background youth and adults relate to the Holocaust memory in Germany. What are the doors for them to engage with it, doors that are open and the doors that are closed. So Juliana worked for many years as a guide at a number of former concentration camps in Germany. I asked about her impressions of Muslim minority Germans visiting the camps. Lots of immigrants, meaning Turkish and Arab Germans, visited, she told me. And I had a feeling that they were different from other visitors. After stopping briefly, she added, now, I don't know if they really were different, but I could tell that I and other guides were irritated by them. There was a feeling that they did not belong there and that they should not be engaging with the German past. Somehow, their presence at the camp did not fit. End of quote. When I pushed her further to explain what she meant, Juliana said, for example, when they go to the camps, immigrants start to feel they will be sent there next. They come out of the camp anxious and afraid. And I do not like it at all when they do that. And I do not even want to take them there. Mehmet, a German history teacher of Turkish background, worked in a Holocaust education program for immigrants, which is now quite a sizable industry in Germany and other West European countries. He told me that some students did not want to talk about the Jews' suffering because, he told me, according to them, it is always about the Jews and no one cares about them. Arab students in particular, he said, raise the topic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when we bring up the Holocaust. They compare Israelis to Nazis and say that Palestinians are the victims of the new Holocaust carried out by Israelis. obviously it is a problem when it happens in the classroom. Such discussions about how Muslim minority Germans, specifically Turkish and Arab Germans, do not engage with the Holocaust in the right way became a concern for Holocaust educators in the 1990s, and recently became a matter of political discussion. In June 2015, Kurt Steiner, an MP from the Christian Social Union in Bavaria, declared that students who come from Muslim, refugee, and asylum-seeking families do not need to visit concentration camps as part of their education. Mr. Steiner explained, quote, Muslims and refugees do not have any connection to the history of German National Socialism, and this should remain so. He further explained, one should be careful with such students because they face cognitive and emotional challenges. Left-wing politicians responded swiftly to his statement. Georg Rosenthal of the Social Democrat Party responded that visiting the scene of Nazi crimes is especially important for young immigrants so that they can understand why they need to assume responsibility for German history. So although there is no consensus about what exactly is wrong about the way Muslim minority Germans and Europeans in general engage with the Holocaust, there is a widely shared recent public discomfort about it. Newspapers run stories about how Muslim students refuse to attend concentration camp tours and do not engage with the material on National Socialism in history classes. Mr. Rosenthal's statement reveals that the core of the perceived problem is an emotional as well as cognitive challenge that is seen as specific to the Muslim minority, that prevents them from having empathy towards Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Educators often complain to me and to others about unfeeling emotions Muslim minority members express in relation to the Holocaust. Most complaints included fear that something like the Holocaust may happen to them as well, like Juliana's example, jealousy about Jewish victim status, victim competition, and pride for their national background, especially in the case of Turks. So I don't have the time to give ethnographic examples about how these things unfolded, but these were three issues that came up repeatedly. Some German experts utilize outmoded national character analysis to explain the root of the problem with an essentialized approach towards Turkish and Arab cultures. They suggest Arabs have a tendency towards self-victimization, and Turks feel inherently proud, leading both groups to an inability to empathize with Jewish victims. Others think because the German education system does not recognize their identities, Turkish and Arab background immigrants focus on themselves instead of the victims of the Holocaust. While experts try to explain what is wrong with how Muslims relate to the Holocaust and why, governmental and non-governmental organizations in Germany, France, the Netherlands, Austria, and Switzerland fund dozens of extracurricular programs designed specifically to teach the Muslim minority about National Socialism and encourage them to empathize with Jewish victims, even though those students do participate in the national curriculum, but there are additional programs designed specifically for Muslims. In such programs, Muslim minorities are taught help, survival, civil courage, and resistance to authoritarian structures as part of their integration into German society as democratic citizens. In orientation programs organized for Muslims as well as non-Muslim migrants, participants are schooled to remember, mourn, and even feel shame for events that predated their arrival in Germany by decades. So despite all these special resources devoted to non-German, and especially Turkish and Arab and other Muslim background citizens, and residents continue to be accused of not relating to the Holocaust memory correctly and not taking responsibility of this massive crime on their shoulders. What might be triggering this strong need to develop specific Holocaust education programs for a racialized minority that is increasingly seen as in opposition to European identity? What does this popular conviction about the non-translatability of regular Holocaust education and empathy it should achieve across ethnic and religious boundaries reveal about the basis of Holocaust memory, culture, and education in relation to national identification in Germany. In my research, I focus on specific instances in which emotional reactions of Muslim minority Germans towards the Holocaust are judged as not empathetic enough and morally wrong. And in the larger project, I explore how Holocaust education and the contemporary understanding of empathy aim to learn lessons from the worst manifestation of racism in history at times becomes a way to exclude minorities from the fold of the German/European moral makeup and national belonging. I argue that returning to the 20th century discussions of empathy in the German language, especially as it was developed by Edmund Husserl, allows for the experience of intersubjective connection to be understood in its fuller capacity or complexity. On this basis, I critique Holocaust education in Germany and the conceptualization of empathy around which it has been constituted. This critique turns the inquiry around so that rather than the emotional reactions of Muslim minority Germans towards the Holocaust being on trial as not empathetic and morally lacking, I suggest if it is possible to query the assumptions about German national belonging and more general international belonging that offers a single historical experiential perspective as a moral standard. Once we build on Husserl's emphasis on the intersubjective nature of empathy, we can see that the previous experiences and positionality of the empathizers and not their moral qualities prove to shape the nature of the empathetic process. Husserl talks a lot about the experience of swapping shoes, and I argue that we can relate to the experience of another person only through the perspective of where we stand, the shoes that we leave in order to wear other shoes shape our relationship. So in my many visits to concentration camps and other Holocaust education programs with the youth showed me that, I mean, maybe there are few outliers, but none of them feels, oh, there was no Jewish suffering, oh, you know, it doesn't matter, oh, this Holocaust, that doesn't matter. But how they relate it is that they relate from their own position of marginality, their own position of being racialized. You know, these places are to scare people, right? You know, no one goes to Auschwitz and leaves the place non-scared. But then when minorities go there, they say, oh my God, if I was here then, I would be the person, you know, who would be in these gas chambers. But what is so interesting is that then the teachers get really angry at them. No, you should not feel like that. This is not how to relate to it. Or they say, why do we always talk about Jews? You know, why can't we talk about also our own marginalization, our own racialization? Why can't we talk about the Middle East? So what I'm trying to say is that people, you know, if the Holocaust is a lesson for all of us to learn, and also if it is the core of German national identity and European national identity, there needs to be space for people to relate to it from their own position, rather than assuming that everyone should be able to relate to it from a perpetrator or potential perpetrator position and has empathy in that regard. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you to Professor Ozyurek for bringing in such a unique perspective. As you can see, we have different views on the topic. Our last speaker is Professor Joseph Weiler. He is a professor at NYU Law School and a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Previously, he was the president of the European University Institute in Florence. Professor Weiler is the editor-in-chief of two of the leading law journals, European Journal of International Law and the International Journal of Constitutional Law. His research focuses on international law, comparative law, and European law. Professor Weiler, please.
Thank you very much. The conference is about migration, borders, and identity, and I don't think we've spent much time on identity. And I want to talk about identity, and particularly about national identity. In circles such as these, national identity smells bad. We think Orban, we think Kurz, we think Salvini, we think of what we call populists. It's all the malaise of nationalism, and nationalism is only 1 centimeter away from fascism. So we don't walk comfortably with the concept of national identity. And what I want to do first is to make the moral case for identity and national identity. Then I want to explain why it still has such a tremendous appeal in the lives of so many people, because although I have no patience and no like for the likes of Orban and Marine Le Pen and Salvini and Kurz, but there are millions and millions of Europeans, it's not a marginal phenomenon, who are following them, and I simply refuse to characterize all of these as fascists or idiots. And I also don't like the word populist. If we like it, they populate. If we don't like it, they populists. So I want to try and understand where this is coming from. So the second will be why the continued appeal of national identity. And then I will, in a very European context, how we have mishandled the question so that we've opened the gates for the likes of the Orbans, etc. So whence the actual value, not from a social science point of view, appeal, but from a moral philosophy point of view, the value of identity and national identity. So there's a religious version, there's an equally compelling secular one, but the religious one is actually very easy to explain. So all of us, men and women, have been born, were created in the image of God. And being created in the image of God leads us to the most essential value that we value in liberal democracies, in our liberal societies, which is human dignity. In practically every constitution, the first fundamental right is human dignity is inviolable. Kvod Adam v'cheruto. The United States is the exception that puts liberty as number one. And in what consists that human dignity that comes from the creation in the image of God? So there are two sides to this coin as I see it. One is that all of us, rich and poor, tall and short, fat and thin, etc., share an equal worth. We cannot say of anybody that he is worth more in an essential sense than somebody else, because we are all created in the image of God. And into our language, even into our secular language, creep in religious imagery, the sanctity of life, and that everybody has to be treated, even in the most extreme circumstances, remembering that it is a creature created in the image of God. So there's this equal worth of everybody. But the other side of that coin is that each one of us is unique in the whole of human history, whether it's 10,000 or 100,000 years. Nobody has ever lived which is exactly like Mark Lilla. He is in many ways totally special. And nobody will ever live which is exactly like Mark Lilla. So each of us has a uniqueness which is essentially us. And to treat us as fungible, you're no different from anybody else, and not recognizing that uniqueness is equally an assault on our human dignity as to say that somebody is worth more than somebody else. And if that is true for the individual subject, that deep value rooted in dignity of our uniqueness, it is also true for our collective identities. So there might be something, and it's valid and valuable, called sovereign equality, but I'm Italian, and in some ways I'm not French. And it's okay for me to celebrate my unique identity as Italian. My history, my language, my food, my dress, my literature, my poetry, my music, and everything that goes with that, without disrespecting the other. But don't please try and take from me that kind of uniqueness and allow me not only to celebrate it, but to cultivate it, to preserve it. So national identity in this case, in this sense, in my view, is rooted in a deep moral justification. Why is it so appealing? I want to postulate something. I want to postulate that every human being is in deep existential quest for giving meaning to our short life. So it's not only about existing and putting food on the table and prospering, etc., but also we want to be able to say that our lives have meant something. And usually for our lives to mean something, it has to be that it means something more than just my self-interest, that I have contributed something that transcends my specific self-interest. So I'm postulating that. I'm saying it explains a lot of human behavior. Now, national identity appeals to that. National identity appeals to that. It doesn't speak much to, I think, what you call the elites or academics, etc., because we think the books we write give meaning to our life, they will survive us, etc. Self-deception, but we all know it's a very narcissistic profession. But think about national identity. It's, first of all, inclusive. It's rich and poor, it's old and young. It's everybody who belongs to the nation belongs to the nation. It transcends tribes, etc. And secondly, it's very, very rich, because as I mentioned, there is literature, and there's culinary tradition, and there is history, and there's poetry, and there's music. There's a huge cultural asset that goes with that. Now, history is important, because I might die, but my nation won't die, and that gives meaning to my existence. And I might not be the one who wrote the Nobel Prize-winning book, but I'm part of a cultural asset, which is the cultural asset of my national identity. And that also gives meaning to my life. And I have a history, because I have a collective history, which is part of my national history. So in the quest, in that existential quest of giving meaning to our life, there can be other vehicles. But we can see that national identity maintains its appeal because it corresponds to that thing. And that, therefore, I agree with many of the things that Mark Lilah said, but also with one of the comments. It's silly to think that the crisis we have now in, I'll speak about Europe again, the Euroscepticism, the challenges to the liberal democratic state, it's all about economics. It's all connected to Gini factors and unequal distribution of the deserts of globalization. It has to do with that, but that's not the only thing. People are not only economic agents, and their dignity, their self-understanding, their existence is driven by other factors as well. And this national thing, national identity that I was talking about, is part of that story. Why is there a crisis? And now I'm specifically European, so I know most people here are either Israelis or American. Careful with the parallels. Careful with the parallels. So for decades since the Second World War, for example, the word patriotism was anathema in Europe. Nobody could declare themselves to be a patriot. The only place you could wave a flag was at a football match. And we understand why, and it is understandable. Because patriotism was associated with fascism, with Mussolini, with Hitler, with Franco, etc. It was a bad word. But it was one form of patriotism, the fascist patriotism, where the individual belongs to the state. Not the glorious patriotism which comes from the Republican democratic tradition, where the state belongs to the individual. And the individual has a stake in the state, etc. But that whole vocabulary of patriotism, the only one that was allowed was constitutional patriotism, Allah Habermas. But we note about constitutional patriotism, there's no difference between the Italian, the French, the Spanish, or the Lithuanian constitutional patriot. They all believe in the same set of values which are encapsulated in the European Convention on Human Rights. There's very little margin in the ideological profile of the constitutional patriot. So it doesn't respond to that need to feel unique and special and celebrates one national identity, etc. And then here I would have put in a whole thing, but Mark spoke about it. Democratic structures in Europe just do not respond to that. Why was in Brexit the most potent slogan taking back control? And I regret Brexit deeply as a European. Europe without Great Britain is a very different Europe. But taking back control resonated, and it resonates not only in Britain. Brexit is just an extreme example of that, because there really has been a loss of control, and there continues to be a deep democratic deficit in the governance of the European Union. So people have a feel that they don't control. Now, you know, when you're told to drive 80 kilometers an hour, you drive 95 before the police stop you. We were told to speak 12 minutes, but everybody except one spoke 14 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to steal, with your permission, you know, those 10 kilometers an hour on the motorway. In Europe, we've thrown away the baby with the bathwater, because instead of the debate being what kind of national identity, does the immigrant really threaten our national identity? Can we take pride in, for example, what Angela Merkel did, etc.? How do we want to understand the relationship between the nation state and a state of all its citizens? Is there contradiction to say that Italy is the state of the Italians, but in Italy there are groups of people who share a different culture, etc., and are equal Italian citizens to whom the state belongs in exactly the same way it relates to ethnic Italians, etc.? How do we think of nations like the United Kingdom, which is a nation of nations, or Spain is a nation of nations, although they don't want to acknowledge it, etc.? Instead of that being the center of the debate about who we are, we just buried it because we can't speak about nationalism. Because to say national identity is almost, in Spanish you would say a palabrota, a bad word. It's a kind of F word. So we just left that field open to the likes of Orban, to the likes of Kurz, to the likes of Salvini, who come in with one version of national identity, which is proto-fascist, which is atavistic, and is not necessarily the only one, but the alternatives are just not part of our political discourse. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Weiler for bringing us to the core of the discussion. I don't want to say a lot. I want to open it for questions and let you speak. But just on the last presentation, it begs, I want to briefly mention 3 issues. So the first issue is what kind of, specifically in Europe, and I want to focus also in Europe as well, what kind of national identity, cultural identity states try to protect, to defend. Now, I've been doing research, like some of the people here, on that topic for the last few years. And interestingly enough, national identity has not been a legal concept until recently. I mean, this was more a sociological, anthropological, philosophical, if you want, religious concept. What is fascinating, particularly in Europe, is that for the last 10 years or 5 years, European states try to come up with a legal definition of their national identity. It started in the UK. The British government in 2007 established a committee, a government committee, to investigate the concept of Britishness, and they published after 2 years a Britishness pie. This is our national identity. A few years after, in 2009, in France, back then President Sarkozy, this was before the election, November 2009, he made like a reality TV show. He posed to the public a question, a quote, "For you, what does it mean to be French?" And this was debated for 3 months, after which the French government collected all those thousands of replies and published a report on the meaning, the essence of Frenchness, according, they said it's un-French to have a committee to investigate Frenchness, or just pose it to the public. And what is interesting, and here Professor Kristen Jobke wrote about it quite a lot, about this paradox of universalism, that states try to come up with this very unique sense of identity that they try to protect, to defend, to define, and yet ended up with a universal version of political liberalism, or at maximum, local interpretation of universal version of political liberalism. And I found it fascinating. Now, one reason is that maybe because of the because of the historical experiments, etc., maybe they don't say exactly what they try to protect, but legally speaking, we ended up with a more universal conception of national identity rather than the particular. And this brings me to the last question, which I posed at the beginning. This is the question of Professor Halbertal from yesterday. I think this is the core. Imagine that we can agree on national identity, and imagine that we can agree that there is something particular that is particularly Canadian for this sense, which distinguishes the Canadians from the American. And imagine that, again, there is no issue of migration that pose risk to liberalism, because, of course, one of the challenges is that if migration, I mean, the easiest cases where migration brings about a fundamentally more just society or fundamentally less just societies. That's the easy case. But what if the migration brings about more or less just society, but different? What exactly would be, what the ground, or how legitimate would it be from legal point of view, from political morality point of view, to protect this uniqueness that distinguishes the here from there? And with this question, which I hope we will discuss, I want to open it to more questions. I will collect 3 from here, 3 from there, and we'll do it in different rounds. So Professor Waldron, 1, 2, and 3.
I wanted to address what Professor Weiler, my dear friend and colleague, was saying about national identity. I have no doubt that national identity plays an important role in sustaining the kind of solidarity that is needed in a society and in the political agency of a polity. I do have grave doubts about Professor Weiler's attempt to derive it from the notion of the image of God and humans being created in the image of God. I found that close to blasphemous. Professor Weiler said that he was going to take some extra time, like the 10 kilometers over the speed limit, but he devoted about 5 seconds to that suggestion that as you move from humans being all created in the image of God, man and woman created in the image of God, to the notion of human dignity, and then to the notion of the uniqueness and the unique, non-fungible value of every person. And then suddenly we're in the realm of national identity, that the key to human uniqueness is national identity. As I said, I have no doubt that national identity is important, but it seems to me that this is preposterous as a way of stating that importance. The uniqueness of each person is partly a way of insisting that even within their own national community, where you're a German and I'm a German, nevertheless they can't replace you with me. They can't shoot down an airplane containing 100 Germans in order to save a building with 1,000 Germans. You remember the air safety statute decision by the Constitutional Court. And that we maintain this notion of the uniqueness, the importance of each individual, precisely as a way of resisting any suggestion that, look, it's just another German, or it's just another bearer of this identity. So if there is an importance of national identity, and I agree with the one observation that Professor Weiler made that attempts to capture that and state it and discover it through surveys usually results in absurdity. If there is an importance of national identity, and I think attempts to stress the distinctiveness and even the uniqueness of each nation's identity, it's a tactic used by grade school teachers when they are introducing people to dances and cuisines other than their own. Many identities that are most important to people are things they share with other people all around the world. But most of all, I fail to see the connection with the uniqueness underwritten by the notion of each of us created in the image of God. And I'd like to have more than 10 seconds on that.
Hello, I'm Larissa Ramanik, and the question is to Majid Al-Haj, with whom I've shared for many years the interest and focus on studying the Russian-speaking Jews in this country. And I'll start with a comment and then I'll proceed to ask a question. Well, I generally agree with your diagnosis that Russian-speaking Israelis are or may comprise a separate ethnic group. But I would limit this diagnosis to their first generation, to those who have come here as adults and were mainly socialized within the former Soviet or post-Soviet states, right? When it comes to the generation 1.5, that is those who came as children or adolescents, their ethnic identity is much more ambivalent and spread between the various options of Ashkenaziness, Mizrahiness, and Israeliness, and most of them do not think of themselves as Russians anymore. So it very much depends where they are located in the Israeli society. And there are not so few young Russian Israelis who became much more Mizrahi than Ashkenazi, despite the fact that their ethnic origin is, of course, Ashkenazi. So this is the comment, and the question is whether in this new book of yours that I deeply welcome and am very curious to see, do you deal with the very complex and tense relationships between Russian Israelis and Israeli Arabs, which is another domain of your study? Thank you.
Last one, Professor Samucha.
Since my name was mentioned in the context of Russian ethnicity, let me just make a comment or a question. I believe that the Russian speakers, it's not Russians really, they are Russian speakers. The Russian speakers cannot maintain, and they will not maintain, their separate ethnicity if they don't have a separate educational system. They cannot maintain their language as the main language, as the way they think in the language, and for the second generation. So the basis of ethnicity in Israel is language and education. And this is in transitional phase with regard to the Russians. Now let me now make a comment about multiculturalism in Europe or in the West. It is very thin, it's very superficial. The West in North America, except Canada, Switzerland, Belgium, these are the three countries which are based on institutionalized, separate national identities or cultures. All the rest, they have one language, one culture, they are based on assimilation or genocide. The record of the West vis-a-vis ethnicities, other ethnicities, was genocide physically in North America, in Australia, New Zealand, and other places, and assimilation, I mean the destruction of ethnicities of other groups. So what we are having today is just, I mean, we had maybe 25 years in Europe where you have some tolerance, but now we are going back into into assimilation and uniculturalism, and all the idea of multiculturalism was really a fake news for Europe.
I will pray with particular fervence next Yom Kippur. I think it's the first time I've been accused of blasphemy. There's always a first time for everything. This is how I think I see the connection, Jeremy, because I think the human being that is created in the image of God, from which I derive the notion of basic human dignity, from that very inception has always been a social human being. It's not only significant in terms of gender relations, but also in terms of sociality, that it says man and woman created he them. So the way the divine addresses the human condition is not only as individuals, but from inception as a social reality. From then onwards, it's kedoshim to you, you shall be holy in the plural, not you shall be holy as an individual. And so that leads me to the notion that there is a meaningful concept of collective identity. Now, it can come into tension with individual identity, as you pointed out. And it doesn't mean automatically that the national identity, or that the collective identity is supreme over the unique individual identity. But I think there's a lot of purchase to the notion that part of the human condition is social, and if part of the human condition is social, it's meaningful to talk about collective identity. And then I just gave an example. I said one form, one very appealing form of collective identity is national identity. It comes with dangers, but it's a legitimate form of collective identity. And since I have my extra 10 seconds, I will add another on the list of virtues rather than the list of vices of national identity is something that you said. In the word democracy, demos is not a lexical artifact. If we don't have a robust demos, and we can define demos in different ways, it doesn't have to be racial, it doesn't have to be ethnic, it doesn't have to be organic, etc. But if we have a weak sense of demos, we will have a weak sense of democracy. And therefore, all I'm saying is that collective identity I find as ontological, as part of the human condition, and one form of it is national identity, one form of collective identity, and therefore I tried to ground it, and I said, per se, it is not an aberrational concept. It can be a concept full of dignity.
Thank you.
That's the best I can do at this point. But as good liberals, we can agree to disagree.
Well, the first question regarding the 1.5 generation, I agree with you. I think that there are differences within the Russian immigrants in Israel, and these differences apply also to differences between the young generation and the old generation. And it has to do also with the relationships between Israeli Arabs and Russian immigrants. Actually, I was the first one to research this issue because until my studies started, everybody thought that Arabs in Israel have nothing to do with immigration because it's an internal Jewish issue. And I thought that no, it's a citizenship issue and should be researched. The Arabs in Israel are about 20% of the population. In many communities, there have become mixed communities like Carmel and other communities. So to make a long story short, as a whole, the Russian immigrants in Israel have much more extremist attitudes regarding Arabs than the other veteran Israelis. And they perceive them as a natural candidate for discrimination. They perceive them as outsiders, and it's really contradictory with what have been expected. Because the Arabs in Israel from the very beginning expected that they are coming from a communist regime, they have leftist ideas, this is what was the image of Russian immigrants, and therefore they can really make bridges with them. It's not the case. But once again, there are differences even in this issue among Russian immigrants. The younger generation is much more open towards Arabs than the old generation. The old generation is very, very, what we can say, post-Soviet Orientalist generation who actually perceive the hatred of Arabs as an entrance ticket to the Israeli consensus in Israel. The new generation has more contact with the Arabs in the universities, in the education system, in higher education, and they are much more open to them. Now, Sami, to your question, yeah, well, a separate educational system, of course, would further reinforce the ethnicity among Russian immigrants. But as a matter of fact, despite the joint education system, they still have all the other elements of ethnicity. Because the Ashkenazi group, not all of them have a separate education system, and yet you call them Ashkenazi and you define them as Ashkenazi. I think that they are much more ethnic than you tend to think, and of course I know your articles. because, first of all, regarding the language, despite of the very fact that they study in the same education system, but different studies, including those of Lasham and Lasham and other studies, point out that over time, even the Russian immigrants are using the Russian language even much more than before. First of all, because they have become stronger. Secondly, they have become larger. And the availability of other Russians to speak the Russian language is much more than it was in the 1990s. And the second issue, I think that they perceive that ethnicity in Israel is not a burden anymore. It's an asset. It's a society where the civil circle is not the strongest circle. It's still a circle, but it is very weak. The other circles, which are based on ethnicity, on religion, and on nationality, are much more stronger. This is why I call this society a tribal society, because there is a gap between the social structure of Israel, which is very multicultural, and the political culture in Israel, which is very, very ethno-national. And it's closed, it's not all-inclusive culture. And this is why I think that ethnicity will continue. Probably it will change the colors over time, but yet it will remain an ethnicity. Thank you very much.
I was just going to add one thing after hearing Joseph and Jeremy speak. If we believe that there is not only the possibility of national identities having some standing morally or some dignity bequeathed by God, that doesn't mean that we can't imagine different kinds of nations having different understandings of how open and closed they are. That there are nations that see themselves as open societies, and that becomes part of the identitarian glue, you might say, that holds them together. We cannot expect the world to be America. And Americans need to learn that. They need to learn that militarily, but they also need to learn that in terms of these sorts of questions as well. So I'm for a diversity of approaches to these sorts of questions. Back in the 1970s, a radio station in Vancouver, Canada, ran a contest because in the 1970s, American states were all developing license plates that had little slogans. So Virginia's for lovers, Michigan, the land of lakes, right? And Canada didn't have one. And so the radio station decided to come up with one. And the contest was this. It would begin, "It's as Canadian as." Thousands of entries. The winner was, "It's as Canadian as possible under the circumstances." That is Canadian nationalism.
Just an anecdote on that. In the UK, about a few years ago, they started to search for a British motto. They said, we want to have a British motto to unite us all. So the BBC made this campaign, and the winner motto was, "No mottos, please, we are British." So this was the winner. I'm going to collect a few more questions. I see more hands than I could afford, so I apologize in advance for those I cannot give them the opportunity to ask.
Can I add a footnote to Mark Lilla?
Yes,
one of the
please,
greatest students or scholars of nationalism is the German Birkenförder. And one of his fundamental insights, he says, what distinguishes the identity of different nations is also the way they understand what it is to be a nation.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentations and for good presentations. My question is, Professor Weiler, regarding to your analysis and the terminology that you used, I would like to ask you how you read the Israeli situation, and especially after the nation-state law regarding to national identity, patriotism, and we know that the nation-state law, there is no mention of democracy, of dignity, or other universal values.
That's a minor question. Yes, please.
Two quick questions. I'm flattered to be considered in Mark's elite category, and I think that his analysis was spot on, but the language of calling one group an elite and the other group as below is loaded language. And I think if we can't come up with something a little bit more, less loaded, it'll be really hard to talk about a bridge between the two groups or a compromise. As far as the nationalism goes, what's missing to my ear is religion. What we find in America is that immigrant groups who have the same religion tend to intermarry with each other much more quickly than we get religious intermarriage. And the ethnic groups that persist for more than 3 or 4 generations as distinctive are the ones that have their own religion. So I think religion is an important dimension of nationalism in European countries, where each country is associated with 1 to 3 religions, depending on the country, but not in America, except in a somewhat different form. So I think that if we're talking about identity of different immigrant groups as they assimilate, religion is a very important dimension that for whatever reason hasn't been mentioned much.
Thank you.
חשוב לי להגיד כמה דברים כאן, אני לא יודע אם זה שאלה, ואני לא יודע אם זה התייחסות, והיא קצרה מאוד. ואני מרגיש החמצה מסוימת אחרי שדוקטור מג'ד אל-חאג' דיבר כאן, ואני אגיד למה, אבל לפני זה אני אציג את עצמי ואגיד שאני תושב מדינת ישראל, אני פלסטיני, שורשים שלי לפלסטינים, ואני גר במדינת ישראל, נולדתי כאן, וכשאני מסתכל על הלוגו של ההזמנה, אני רואה שההזמנה מאחדת 3 שפות, ערבית, עברית ואנגלית, ספינה מטלטלת בתוך הים, ולמעשה ההגירה היא בתוך המקום הזה. למה אין נושא שמדבר על הנרטיב הפלסטיני והציוני ביחד? צריך להפגיש את שני הנרטיבים כאן כדי לדבר עליהם. אני חושב שזו נקודה מאוד חשובה להכיר שבתוך מדינת ישראל צריך להיות דיאלוג שמושתת ומובנה ומתקיים על בסיס של הכרה בנרטיב של האחר, בהכרה של לדבר איתו ולקיים דיון איתו. ולכן אני חושב שיש כאן החמצה מסוימת וצריך להעלות את זה כאן. אנשים נמצאים כאן חשובים, אנשים חשובים שבאים מכל העולם, תושבי מדינת ישראל. אני אדם שמגדיר את עצמי כמאמין גדול בדיאלוג שמושתת על הכרה באחר, בכאב שלו, בנרטיב שלו, בזיכרון שלו. אני מכיר בנרטיב הציוני, אני מכיר בזיכרון הציוני, אני רוצה שיסתכלו גם אליי. אז הזמינו אותי כאן ואני לא רואה שום התייחסות אליי כשאני נמצא כאן. מישהו צריך לדבר על זה, ולכן אני מרגיש החמצה גדולה שמג'ד אל-חאג' שהוא ערבי תושב מדינת ישראל, היה צריך להתייחס לזה, והוא לא התייחס לזה, ולכן אני אומר, אם אני יצא כאן מבלי שיתייחסו לזה, אני מרגיש החמצה מסוימת, ולכן עכשיו אחרי השאלה יש משאלה. אולי הספרייה הלאומית תקיים דיון נוסף על ההגירה ועל הנרטיב שמתקיים כאן, המשותף שמתקיים בתוך מדינת ישראל. תודה רבה.
Thank you. I would allow 2 last questions. Yes, please, and Kristen, you will be the last one.
I was glad to hear Mark's addendum to the notion of the nation state, because I think that our sort of the liberal aversion to nationalism and national identity of the nation state is based on the assumption that the nation state is mono-ethnic, that it's an ethno-nationalist state. And of course, the ethno-nationalist state has been historically an exception. I mean, I come from Poland, my parents came from the Ukraine, before the war. It was a territory which was completely multicultural, as were many other parts of the world. I think the great shock to Western European countries and to Western European democracies has been the very rapid influx of multicultural immigration and the scale of immigration into nations which were in fact monocultural for a long time, and in which the notion of nation and the notion of culture were coeval, were equivalent. So I don't think we have to have a monoethnic nation state, but we do need to have a polity or a demos, terms which came up, spheres of solidarity. The merit of the nation state is, first of all, that it protects, equal rights and equal laws for its citizens, and, that absolutely needs to be preserved and strengthened. But we also need spheres of solidarity within which diversity can be contained. I mean, in other words, I think the big challenge is how to combine diversity with solidarity. And solidarity has to be based, I think, on adherence to some shared norms, to some common norms. And the question, I suppose, is, what do you think, what common norms or nation states or the states of entry allowed to ask for or even to require? I could give some quick examples, from... Sorry?
Yes, please, but we have to be brief.
Okay, two very quick things. For example, there's been a number of honor killings in Britain every year. So clearly one legislates at that extremity. One does not allow honor killings. But Britain agonized for many years about whether to forbid female genital mutilation. It has now been made illegal. It wasn't illegal for a long time. So that's a question of what norms, where do we set the boundaries of what is allowed?
He said it's the non-nationalism of elites that produces extreme nationalism of the right, the Orbans, etc. So you put your finger on the important issue, what explains this populist moment, however you may call that thing. Now, there are too many negative cases to make this, at face value, of course, plausible analysis really plausible. Think about big countries in the West. Think about France. They are obsessed with Frenchness and national identity stuff, at least 1989, since the first foulard growing by the year. In the UK, one interesting statistics of the Brexit vote is 3/4 of those who favor the death penalty voted for Brexit. That also is not explainable in national terms. Think about the United States. That is the one country in the West where nationalism had never receded from the elite level, and still they're dealing with Trump. I warn against the recipe of Professor Weiler's analysis. In Germany, we would call it den Teufel mit dem Beelzebub austreiben, to combat bad nationalism with good nationalism. The real issue, who are supporting neo-nationalism, populism, however you want to call it, is that they are the losers of global. In the region, the famous elephant curve, they have not seen their income growth. Therefore, the issue is socioeconomics. It's not nationalism. That's the wrong proposition. It's also halfway the wrong analysis. It's exactly the analysis of the populist. Therefore, the yellow vests in France are so interesting. That's the first non-populist movement on behalf of those who support neo-nationalism that is not in neo-nationalist terms. Unfortunately, Macron managed to put them into the corner of the casseurs. They're just destroying, they are just extreme nationalists. He lost an opportunity to societies.
Thank you to Professor Jobke. I would allow 1 minute for kind of last statement. Don't feel obliged to answer all those questions. Professor Al-Haj, we'll start with you.
I agree with you completely that in such an important conference, the issue of Palestinian narrative and the Zionist narrative should be addressed. But I don't know why you blame me, because I am not on an Arab slot. אני לא על תקן של ערבי, אני על תקן של סוציולוג. And I came here to speak on the issue of ethnic formation and identity among Russian immigrants. I've addressed these issues in other studies that I've conducted, but there is no place for this in my specific presentation. Thank you very much.
הציפיות שלי ממך היו כסוציולוג ערבי להתייחס לסוגיה הערבית. זה הכל. כן.
Okay, I will try to answer your question where you talk about Europeans had to deal with a very rapid diversification. I would say this is a myth that comes again and again. Muslims and Jews have existed in Europe for a long time. Europe has been struggling with diversity for a long time and also has all the amazing things that we have in Europe exists out of a dialogue between Jews and Muslims and Christians. But despite that, again and again, it is always said, oh, Muslims have just arrived, so we are going to adjust. I think this is a myth that, helps legitimizing not being able to deal with the situation. When it comes to shared norms, I cannot more agree that they need to be universal. But what is so cunning about West European values is that they come as if they are universal, but in the end, they end up being particular. For example, in France, laïcité. In Netherlands, it is tolerance. In Germany, it is Holocaust memory, right? These are universal values, but at the end, if you look at who is excluded or who is seen as if not having these values, are always the same people. You know, so it is, even though they speak, so it ends up that white Dutch people are always tolerant, and it is always the Muslims who are not tolerant. You know, so it is very important for us to see these cunning ways in which these narratives are being narrated.
Just very quickly in response to Carmel Chiswick. What I was trying to do in my talk was to ventriloquize, to be a ventriloquist, right? To say that what is it like from the point of view of people who are complaining about multiculturalism and immigration, what is their imaginaire? How do they look at these things? And so the terms I used were their terms. And when we're talking about elites and so on. I mean, I would use the word elite too, but with not all the connotations that they would have. We are all elites, let's face that, being in this room. But in response to Christian very quickly, I think you're falling right into the trap that I was talking about, which is that it's the condescension in what you just said. These people, when they speak, the nationalists, they don't mean what they're saying. I, from a superior position, understand it's all economics, and so the dead weight of some kind of Marxist view still kind of shows its face. You don't mean it when you say that you're upset about gender education in the schools. You don't mean it when you say that I'm upset because the cafes in my little town in France now won't accept women. That isn't what you mean. What you mean is you feel that you no longer you're economically and perhaps politically dispossessed. If you want to understand your adversary, you must take them seriously and literally. If you, and I urge you to do this, if you take a look at the manifesto of the murderer in New Zealand, it is an almost perfect crystallization of this mindset that is developed. On the very first page of it, it has something like, it's a circle with 8 sections. And the top sections are all about progressive economics. And the bottom ones are all about cultural conservatism, the family, and ethnic diversity in a good sense, but by country, rather than diversity within countries. We must grasp what people are saying and take it seriously enough to rethink some of our own categories.
I was asked what is my view of the Israeli situation? In 60 seconds, in 30 seconds. I'll just say one thing, which is very banal. The notion that Israel is the the national home of the Jewish people, it, in my view, does not mean that it is not also the state of all its citizens. I don't see a contradiction between these two concepts. So I have the distinction being called a blasphemer by Jeremy and a populist by Christian. This is a good thing to come out of this conference. But my difference with Christian is profound. But you see, I'm a little bit more moderate than you are. I don't deny the importance of the socioeconomic factor. There is something that you know better than I do of overlapping cleavages. But if I look at Brexit, and you pointed out to the death penalty, the Jacob Rees-Moggs and the billions that he represents are not suffering from any socioeconomic deprivation. It's not the economy, it's the identity in that case. And I cannot explain by socioeconomic factors Austria, and I cannot explain by socioeconomic factors Salvini, and I cannot even explain by socioeconomic factors Poland, which weathered this economic crisis of 2008 better than any other country in Europe. So I'm not denying that that is not there, but for me it's just an overlapping cleavage, and I think we have to open our ears that there are these other factors that are playing, and they are identitarian, and not simply if only we put lo ala lechem levado yechia adam, if we only put bread on the table and close the Gini factor, everything will be okay. There's a lot to say about religion in Europe. The first thing to say is that it's not each nation has its own religion. Just look at Germany, just look at the United Kingdom and other countries. So Europe has shown that there can be a sense of national identity which transcends religious differentiations. But the most important thing about Europe and religion is that it's a secular continent. Ratzinger said Christianity in Europe is a minority. Robust, but it's a minority. What we've lost in terms of the discussion we've been having by secularization is, and I don't judge people by their religion. I know many religious people who are awful human beings, and I know confirmed atheists who are noble human beings. But what was important about pre-secular Europe was that every week in the public space there was a ubiquitous voice which did not speak about rights, but spoke about duties and responsibilities as an essential part of the social polity. And that voice speaking about duties and responsibilities has practically been eliminated. And to connect it to our theme, one of the messages of national identity, and the word nationalism already sounds like fascism, so I want to point it, is that the national message also includes a component of duty and responsibility, not only rights and entitlements. And that is something that with secularization one has lost. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot.